Piccolo has the deepest bag in Dragon Ball, and to be specific, when we say he has the deepest bag, we are comparing him to other Dragon Team members, or Z-Fighters, if you want to use that term, instead of comparing him to deities that have an infinite amount of moves that we can't even conceive of. And when we say this, we are referring to a slang term that is often used in NBA circles to refer to a player that has a multitude of moves that makes up their bag when they are on a basketball court. And I can already hear the keyboards or the phone tapping of people getting ready to type, well, what about Goku? Goku's the main character of Dragon Ball. He has the deepest bag. Look at all the things that Goku can do. And you definitely have a point. Goku definitely does have a deep bag, especially because, I mean, he's the main character. But there is one key reason as to why Piccolo has a deeper bag than Goku. And this is for the simple fact that all of Piccolo's techniques are virtually exclusive to him, or techniques that he learned on his own. Whereas when you compare this to Goku, Goku is effectively a composite of a bunch of different masters in Dragon Ball and learned a bunch of different techniques. But he himself did not come up with the overwhelming majority of moves that he's used throughout Dragon Ball, and Piccolo is the originator of pretty much the majority of his own techniques throughout Dragon Ball, and many people copy Piccolo's techniques and learn them for themselves. And there is no better way to begin this video than by discussing Piccolo's signature move and most iconic move in Dragon Ball history, the Makanko Seppo, also known as the Special Beam Cannon. Now, the interesting thing about this technique is that this is a technique that Piccolo created to kill Goku, but because Raditz unexpectedly showed up and Goku and Piccolo weren't individually strong enough to defeat Raditz, they had to team up, and Goku had to sacrifice his life in order to help stop Raditz, when in fact he actually had an opportunity to kill Raditz without having to sacrifice his life. But had he done that, he wouldn't have died, which would have meant that Goku wouldn't have been strong enough to fight against future threats, so in effect it was actually a good thing that Goku died. That's how Dragon Ball What Ifs work. But in terms of the Special Beam Cannon, the one thing that made this technique very unique is that it's an energy beam, but it's an energy beam that's specifically focused on piercing an opponent, whereas when you look at other Dragon Ball techniques, more specifically a technique like the Kamehameha, or even a technique like the Gallic Gun, the way that the beam is designed in its structure is effectively made to eviscerate its opponent. But if the beam isn't strong enough to eviscerate, then it doesn't have that potential. Another technique that you could say is somewhat similar to this in its own nature would have been the Destructo Disc, where energy is designed to slice instead of pierce specifically. But in itself, this technique is more dangerous than a traditional beam blast, which is just designed to eviscerate, because the nature of the energy attack itself gives the potential of killing a character that is significantly more powerful. Now, the interesting thing about the Hellzone Grenade is that when Piccolo used this technique against Android 17, it completely caught him off guard, and had 17 not had an android barrier that unexpectedly just helped him survive this blast, this potentially, in all likelihood, would have killed Android 17, or would have at least severely damaged him enough that Piccolo would have taken the advantage in the fight. Now, granted, Android 17 has infinite energy, but it is still likely to note that if he's severely battle damaged, that could still give Piccolo the edge in a fight. And the way that this technique works is that Piccolo is firing a bunch of blasts at 17, and 17 just thinks that Piccolo's missing, only to realize that it was intentional, with the pure intent of finally collapsing in on the opponent at the very last second when they least expect it and killing them. It has an element of surprise. It's something that wouldn't work on somebody more than once, but it's one of those bag techniques that shows that if you're fighting somebody and you just need to like get one good attack on them once and then they don't expect it, you can kill your opponent with this one technique and then they're dead, so it would never have to be used against the same opponent again. But unfortunately, if you're fighting somebody who has seen it before, this wouldn't really have much of a surprise factor. We also have Piccolo's ability to regenerate, which is something that is very exclusive to Namekians throughout Dragon Ball. But the thing about it with Piccolo is that this is what really helps him separate from the majority of the other Dragon Team members, with the exception of Majin Buu. And unfortunately, because of how regeneration works in Dragon Ball, it kinda sucks because Piccolo's always gonna lose limbs just so the show can always constantly remind us that Piccolo can regenerate. So, while this is not something that is completely exclusive to Piccolo as other characters can regenerate, he's the only Namekian shown regenerating amongst Dragon Team members before we even knew what Dragon Team members were, because the Dragon Team wasn't fully formed yet, and at the same time Piccolo wasn't known as a Namekian, he was considered a demon. Now we also have the Masenko Ha. Now the thing that I find most interesting about the Masenko Ha is that this is Piccolo's technique, but it's somewhat become Gohan's signature move because Gohan uses this technique that he derived from Piccolo, and he uses it so often, mostly when Gohan was a kid, to the point where you can basically say it's Gohan's technique, but it's kind of one of those things where Piccolo has so many techniques, it's like Gohan can make one of them his own signature moves, and Piccolo has so many other things that he doesn't even really have to use this technique much throughout the series himself. Now, different from the multiform technique, Piccolo has his own exclusive way of cloning himself, where he basically splits himself into a completely different being of himself, and that allows him to train, as we saw this first used during the anime-only exclusive portions of the Saiyan arc. What I find the absolute best about Piccolo, especially when we see the anime-only sequence where he's training with himself in the Room of Spirit and Time, is that you can just imagine how much easier it is for Piccolo to train himself as compared to other characters. You can probably guess that this is one of the reasons why Piccolo has always been able to somewhat keep up with the other Saiyans, because of the fact that since he can train with himself, he always has a strong training partner that can push him, whereas other characters mostly need a stronger training partner in order for them to get more powerful, and in many cases they train with somebody who's weaker, so they're not really gaining out of it. But how Piccolo does it, it's different from Tien, where Tien splits himself into other characters. It's like Piccolo's body morphs itself into other characters, more so than actually splitting himself. And that's what makes this iconic to Piccolo, where it's more like a body split than an actual technique split. But then when we move down the list here, we also have the fact that Piccolo learned a reverse Mafuba, which also means that he can also use the traditional Mafuba. Now, this is something that we can assume he learned in memory from King Piccolo, because Piccolo has all of the memories of King Piccolo in him. And because of this, when Kami was disguised as a human and wanted to seal Piccolo away, Piccolo basically reversed the technique on him, and this is something that you can imagine would give Piccolo the ability to defeat far more characters in Dragon Ball history, but it's such an overpowered technique that we can understand why the show doesn't use it, especially because of the fact that Piccolo can regenerate and he's not a human or a Saiyan, so maybe his Namekian physiology would allow him to use the Mafuba without the risk of killing his body, the way that another character like Master Roshi would always have to have that fear in the back of his mind. Now, the Great Namekian was something that was kind of a lost art in Dragon Ball, where for years this was a technique that was effectively just thrown off to the side and just forgotten amongst Dragon Ball lore. But Dragon Ball Super brought this concept of a Great Namekian back when Piccolo used this in conjunction with Orange Piccolo in the battle against Max Cell, where Piccolo becomes a giant. And the thing that makes this technique really interesting, even though it's very specific and it's not really effective against a smaller opponent that's extremely powerful, is the fact that if you're fighting a large range monster type of character, where size would actually give you an advantage in a fight, this is where the technique would be most effective. So if you're fighting a character like a Great Ape, or if you're fighting a character like Max Cell, if you're fighting a character like Hirudegarn, along with another character such as Adi Raza, a technique like this would be really effective in increasing your body mass to increase your brute power in exchange for the lack of speed that's clearly generated as a result of this, creating somewhat of a kaiju-esque ability that the other characters in Dragon Ball simply just do not use. Now, one of the more quiet abilities that Piccolo has had in the Dragon Ball franchise that kind of gets swept under the rug is his ability to hear. And this is why when Trunks showed up, that he was able to hear their entire conversation even though he was far away. And even the first Dragon Ball Z Broly movie had this too, where Piccolo heard his entire conversation with King Kai. It's one of those situations where we kind of have to take the writing with a grain of salt, because there are a lot of moments throughout Dragon Ball where you're like, well, if you can hear all of this stuff, why couldn't you hear this, Piccolo? Why couldn't you hear that? And because of all of that, you can kind of feel the range of the super hearing ability can kind of just be written away where sometimes Piccolo just doesn't have it, very similar to Daredevil in the Daredevil series where he can hear most things throughout the city. So it's one of those things where the writing is very selective when it wants to use this, but it can always revisit this whenever it wants to. Now in Dragon Ball Multiverse, there was a character called Gas Korloth, who was basically a Namekian who was a fusion of all of the other Mekians, and he basically was fused into one Super Namekian to help out in the battle on planet Namek. The thing about this with Piccolo is that all of the other Namekians that we've seen throughout Dragon Ball history don't really fuse. This seems like something that has only been used with Piccolo, specifically as he fused with Nail, and then he also fused with Kami. And before the angry commenters come, when I mean Namekians, I'm referring to other Universe 7 Namekians. We have not really seen them fuse, but Dragon Ball Super did have an interesting backstory with two Universe 6 Namekians with Sawinel and Purina, where basically all of the other Namekians merged into those two specific Namekians so that they would be as strong as possible to help preserve Universe 6. But it would make sense why in most cases most Namekians wouldn't fuse, because of the fact that you're basically going to give up your entire identity to become a catalyst in somebody else, and you would only do that in an emergency situation. But it would have been more interesting for the Tournament of Power to see Sawinel and Purina actually fuse with each other to see one Ultimate Namekian overall. Now when you combine that with the fact that he's also a direct descendant of King Piccolo and has his own father's memories as basically a clone of him, all of this would suggest that Piccolo is 4 people in one person, and because of that, this just shows you how many potential techniques that he's aware of that he hasn't even used in Dragon Ball history. So because of the fusion ability, the depths of Piccolo's wisdom and knowledge, and the expansion of his bag is truly mysterious and unknown throughout Dragon Ball. And last but not least, we had to end Piccolo's bag by discussing the clothes beam. Now, you might think that this is just a simple technique that is used to just change the clothes of another character, but it actually goes a little bit deeper than this, because before Piccolo used the clothes beam in Dragon Ball, there was basically nobody else that we saw having this sort of ability outside of eventually seeing Kibito doing it, who of course has divine origin as an assistant to the Supreme Kai. And for those reasons, we have to give Piccolo credit in saying he's capable of doing something that only gods have been shown to do. And because of this, a lot of fans have theorized that when you look at a character like Kami and a lot of the other Namekians, that Namekians are very, very close to the gods in terms of effectively being mortal students of them, which is a theory that a lot of people have about the Namekian Book of Legends that has never really been expanded on in Dragon Ball. But it is good to show that when you look at the abilities of the Namekians and how godlike they are, it would suggest that they do have some connection to the early deities of Dragon Ball, which would explain their mystical capabilities and the mysteries of their race. So yeah, Piccolo's bag game is definitely on point.